and hello. On behalf of the Shawnee County K-State Research and Extension Office, welcome. Today's presentation is the second of our Fall into Gardening series. We are so pleased our Shawnee County Horticulture agent, Ariel Whitely-Noll, is joining us today to talk about making and using compost. Hi, Ariel. It's so fun to be on here with you like this.
Yes, and I am looking through the names. Is there anybody on here who is not a Shawnee County Extension Master Gardener? Oh, looks like Tony. Okay, I think we have one.
Tony, do you want to be a Master Gardener?
You just take care of that right now.
Yeah. So before I turn it over to Ariel, I'd like to ask that all the participants please turn off their cameras and microphones for the duration of the presentation. If you should have any questions, please type them over in the chat box. And once the presentation is over, we can all turn our mics and cameras back on and have some Q&A. So we will be recording today's webinar, which you'll be able to find later this week on YouTube or our website. And also Kathy Bartles will send out a copy to all our registered participants along with a short survey. I ask that you please do fill out our 3-minute survey. It helps us continue to provide quality programming. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ariel.
Awesome, thank you, Leslie. Give me just 1 second and I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, so I am so glad that you are all able to join us today. I'm really excited to talk about compost. It's something that I think a lot of people maybe don't fully understand the sort of scientific approach to it, but it's also just a great way to use our garden and our kitchen scraps in a really sustainable way and in a way that saves us money in the garden, which I don't know any gardener that isn't at least a little bit frugal. I think that's one of the qualities that make us great gardeners. So today our objectives are going to be learning about how to select and use a compost bin, what materials should be used in compost and what materials shouldn't be used in compost. We are going to learn how to actually create compost, so that scientific process that we need to go to create compost, how to use it in our gardens, and then of course troubleshooting. We want to get sort of those kinks out of the composting process. If you've ever done it before and had issues, hopefully we'll be able to address those today. So what is composting? Composting is modifying a naturally occurring process, which of course natural things decompose, and we're going to use it for our gardens. It's going to be a mixture of soil and decayed organic material, which we're going to talk about exactly what that will be in a moment. It can be used to improve soil, and it's the process of microorganisms in the soil breaking down sugars, proteins, and anything else that's going to be an organic matter, and then it forms this really lovely dark substance that we end up using in our gardens. So the benefits of composting, of course, why would you want to go through the effort of actually composting? Like I mentioned, it's a great way to recycle garden and yard waste into something that you can actually use. So rather than just throwing those things in the trash, you can turn it into something that you can actually use in your garden. It reduces the amount of waste going to landfills. You know, we recycle our cardboard, we recycle our glass bottles, so we should also be recycling some of our organic matter. It reduces water runoff by increasing water holding capacity. So when we have soils that we actually add organic matter to, including compost, that can help those soils retain more water and therefore have less water that's running off into our storm drains. It increases the fertility and nutrient levels in soils. It enhances the physical and chemical properties of the soil, and of course, it saves us money. It can reduce the overall amount of fertilizer you have to put in your garden and maybe some of the other additives that you would want to add to improve soil. We can just use our compost for those. So to get started, first we're going to select a site where water will not stand. We don't want our compost to be a bog. So someplace that dries out. We're going to go through picking a type of composting bin and then of course gathering up those materials to be composted. So when we're looking at bins, I often get a lot of questions about the bins that you see on the bottom left-hand side of the page. So something that's probably very expensive that comes from maybe a big box store or that you get online. And those are fine. If that's what you want to use, I would say the major downside to some of your purchased bins are that they typically produce a very small amount of compost. So you might find yourself adding materials continually, and then after a while you get like a 5-gallon bucket worth of compost, which can be a little bit discouraging for people. But there's nothing wrong with using those. That's what they're created for. The best compost bins that I've ever seen, the ones that I really drool over, are homemade compost bins, because typically it's an experienced composter that knows exactly what they want. And my dream scenario is the compost bin that's in the upper right-hand corner. So that's a 3-bin system. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. But essentially, you are adding materials to one bin. So your banana peels, your coffee grounds, you're adding to that bin. The second bin, you're turning and using, which we're going to talk about turning and why that's important, creating compost in that second bin. And then that third bin, you've already created compost and you're using from that pile. So if you have the space for it, a 3-bin system is great. But if you don't have the space for it, if you only have a small space, or you only have a small amount of maybe kitchen waste, even something as simple as a trash can would work. The only thing that you need to keep in mind is ventilation. So I don't really like this picture because I don't feel like it fully shows it. If you were going to use a trash can like this, that black trash can, you'd want to drill holes in it to make sure that we could get good ventilation in there. So we're talking about what goes into compost. Brown is going to make up about 50% of your compost pile. So your brown materials are where your carbon comes from, and that's going to give something for the microorganisms to feed on. So dried leaves from your yard, grass clippings if they're dried, straw, wood chips, very, very small twigs or pine needles. You want to be careful that if you're using twigs, they aren't too big. That can take up a lot of time to compost something that size. And then newspaper and cardboard. And it's always my preference with those things to shred them. And composting, the smaller you can make the size of whatever you're adding, the quicker it's going to compost. And then the other really important part is green. So our green materials, those are going to add nitrogen and then a little bit of moisture, and that's going to help us a lot with our composting. So fresh grass clippings would be an example of a green. If you are, maybe it's the end of the season for your vegetable garden and you're taking out things like your tomato plants or your other vegetables when they're done, that would be a great green additive. Some of our bigger tomato vines, I would consider running over those with a mower first, just to get that material size a little bit smaller. Depending on how big your tomato plant is, we're getting into tree territory sometimes with how large they are. So just breaking that size up a little bit. Kitchen scraps, eggshells, coffee grounds, banana peels, those are all good green materials. Animal manure is considered a green, but you want to make sure you're not using pet waste. So dog or cat waste we don't want to use, but rabbits, if you have them, cows and horses, if you're lucky enough to have access to that, those are all great green materials to add. And then a little bit of commercial garden fertilizer that can help add nitrogen. That's not 100% necessary for a compost pile, but it's kind of a kickstarter. So you add a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer to your compost pile, that can help give those microorganisms a little boost and they'll start breaking down the compost. So some things you want to avoid. You don't want to add meat. That can really attract especially raccoons, but also possums. You don't want to add any fats or oils, olive oil or anything like that, bacon grease. Those can sort of, same thing, attract the raccoons, but also throw off a little bit of the balance of the compost pile. Like I mentioned, large limbs. I consider large to be anything that's fatter than my finger. So typically I think of twigs and branches that are my finger size. I could snap those, and so that's something I'd add, but if I can't snap it with my hands, if it's too much bigger than my finger, I don't add it. And then pet waste. These are the cutest dogs in the world. These are my dogs. and Rocky and Bindi, and there's only 2 of them, but you would be shocked at the amount of pet waste that they produce. It's staggering. And as much as I would love to be able to use that in my compost pile, I do not. It has to go straight into the garbage. The reason cats and dogs particularly we don't want to use is because they can actually transmit diseases that people are susceptible to. So that is why we say to leave the pet waste out for dogs and cats. Another important consideration is I don't use any of the leaves from my backyard because I am certain that there is going to be pet waste in there somewhere. It's all brown, it hides. So I only use the leaves from my side yard and my front yard in my compost pile just to make sure that they're clean and free from pet waste. And then this is a really nice graphic. This is actually something that you can find on our website. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you guys a link to our website that has a lot of great composting publications. And this chart is on one of them. But this just shows you approximately the proportions that you want to add. So like I said, about 50% of that brown matter, newspaper, straw, about 30% of the green matter, think of those as your kitchen scraps and your garden scraps. 5% of a nitrogen fertilizer, it's not 100% necessary, but it's going to kickstart those microorganisms. 10% of soil. So it is really nice to add soil to your compost pile because that's where you're going to be introducing all those microorganisms. So another way is just to have an open bin where it's open to the ground at the bottom, and that can introduce some microorganisms, but typically microorganisms are going to live below that soil surface. So if you're working in the garden, digging up a plant, just take some of that extra soil and throw it in your compost pile, and it's a good way to introduce those microorganisms. And then 5% water, and we're going to talk about water in just a second. So now that we know what to add, we're going to go through the rules of rotting. So what do we have to do to actually create compost? So the first thing is mass. If you just sort of sprinkle leaves throughout your backyard, sprinkle banana peels throughout your backyard, you're never really going to get compost. Eventually things are going to decompose, but we need to have a nice pile to actually get the composting process started. So we like 3 cubic feet, 3 by 3 by 3 is a really good size. A lot of compost piles, compost bins rather, that you can purchase are going to be that size. That is a disadvantage, again, to maybe some of those smaller compost bins, is you can't get that 3 by 3 pile. If it gets to be larger than 5 cubic feet, it's going to be hard to turn, and turning is really an important part of composting. I do have a master gardener who has a huge compost pile, and he gets coffee grounds from a local coffee shop, and he gets vegetable scraps from a local grocery store, so he has a lot of material that he's adding. He actually turns that compost pile with a rototiller. So that's the kind of work that you're going to be putting in if you have a compost pile that's very large. You can stockpile materials so that you can layer a little more evenly. So if you want to just have a pile of leaves and then you can continually add those to your compost pile, that can be helpful. And then, like I mentioned before, this 3-bin system is just really, it's compost goals. This is what I want to do with my life. If nothing else, I want to grow up and have 3 composting bins. So you can see that sort of green bin is where they're adding that fresh material. That middle bin is where they've already added everything they're going to add, but they're working on turning it to create compost. That last bin, the compost is done. When they go to plant a new plant, they come over and grab some compost from this pile. So they have those 3 systems, because it can be difficult to ever get to using the compost if you're still adding materials to a single pile. Okay, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, but particle size is really important. So the smaller you can make the particles, the quicker it's going to be broken down. So leaves in the fall, if you have a mulching mower and you can mulch and bag those and then add them to the compost pile, that's great. Shredded newspaper, I love taking shredded paper from my office. We have a paper shredder, and so I love to take that and add that to the compost pile. And then any large branches. What's going to happen if you add large branches is they're really not going to contribute to your brown matter, and then you're going to have finished compost with logs in it. So if you can break them down into wood chips, that's going to really help speed up the composting process. And then your carbon to nitrogen ratio. So carbon to nitrogen is your brown to green. So it's just what we talked about earlier. I really like this layering diagram because it can kind of show you what it is. So it's not that you put 50% of your brown on top and 30% of your green on bottom. You want to layer it in so that you have some brown, some green, some brown, some green, sort of as you go along. And then moisture. So like I mentioned earlier, water should make up about 5% of your compost pile. Your pile should be continually damp. So think of a wet sponge. If you have water running out of your compost pile or it's waterlogged, that's going to be too wet. You're going to actually stop the composting process if it gets to be too wet. But you always want it to be a little bit wet. If it totally dries out, those microorganisms can't do their thing. So we just want to keep it like a damp sponge. And then oxygen. Oxygen is a really important part of the compost pile. So if we took that trash can that I showed earlier and there were no holes in it, and you threw your materials in there, they are going to smell very bad very quickly because they don't have oxygen, and that's an important part of the process. So if you do buy a plastic bin or an enclosed container, make sure you get lots of holes in there. We want to get the airflow going so that you can add those aerobic conditions that the microorganisms need. So there are two sort of ways to compost. Faster composting is active. It can take a few weeks up to a couple months. The sort of hard part with the active composting is you have to manage it. So what we're trying to do here is get our pile to get hot, and that means turning it. So we're trying to get it up to about 150 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. We want it to maintain that temperature for 3 days, and then we're turning it. And so that process is going to be true composting. When it gets to that temperature, we're going to see that weed seeds are going to be continually declining if we get up to that 150 and 160. Plant diseases would be killed out at that level. If you're adding manure, sort of the harmful components of manure are killed at 150 to 160 degrees. So those are all benefits of that active method. If we do a passive method, and passive is extremely scientific. Passive is pile it, leave it, and then use it when it all turns brown. So not super scientific, but it is the method that a lot of people use. So passive is just another way of saying you're adding all your stuff to a pile, and at some point it's going to break down and you use that. So it takes a lot longer. It can take up to 2 years for materials to break down if you're not actively turning it and monitoring it. And then another huge downside to passive is weed seeds can live indefinitely in passive piles. They have shown that some weed seeds can live possibly hundreds, if not maybe even into the thousands of years, which is so cool, but bad if you don't want to introduce weed seeds into your garden. So things like that are not going to be killed off in the passive method like they would in the active method. So active can be ready faster. It can be stored for a long period of time. You can store it indefinitely. It destroys those weed seeds. You're not going to leach nutrients, and you're not going to have as many pest problems. Passive, the benefits are that it's much easier to start and it's less work. And this can be a really beneficial way to create organic matter if you're doing vermicomposting, which we're not going to talk today about vermicomposting, but it's a way to break some of those materials down a little bit smaller so that you can then turn around and feed it to your worms. So before I start with using compost, Leslie, are there any questions that you think we need to talk about now? I know I went over a bunch of stuff.
No, but there was kind of a question comment. Brenda
Okay.
was wondering if anybody had heard of a motorized indoor electric composter for kitchen scraps.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I have not heard of that. Has anybody else heard of anything like that?
she said she had had one and that it had broke down and the company had kind of lapsed on giving her the repair part, but
Mm.
it seemed useful for the time being that she had it.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear you say that, because the only sort of indoor composting that I'm aware of is people that keep worm bins, vermicomposting bins in their homes. Other than that, I really wasn't aware of any systems or practices of composting indoors. So that's very interesting. I'll have to look into that. Okay, so now that we've created our compost, we've got our brown and our green, we've added soil and water, maybe a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer. We've either chosen to let those things sit in the passive method for a couple of years before using, or we've been actively monitoring that temperature, which I don't believe I said, but at your garden stores or your farm stores, you can get a composting thermometer. So please do not go outside with your child's thermometer and try to measure the temperature of a compost bin. You want to get a composting thermometer specifically for that. So that can be a helpful way to monitor that temperature. And you should actually be able to feel your compost pile getting hot, which I think is a really cool part of composting. And it can be a really fun thing to involve kids in too, because I think they're kind of interested in that process. So we've created our compost, and we know it's done when it sort of looks like soil. It looks like a fluffy, maybe a little bit larger particle size soil. It should be pretty uniformly brown, and I think compost smells great. I don't know if it's just because my compost pile is like half coffee grounds, but I just think that in general, compost smells lovely. So now that we have that finished product, we're going to switch over to using compost. So for our trees and shrubs, and by trees and shrubs, I'm talking about established. They're already planted in your landscape. We can use compost as a mulch. It's going to help suppress some weeds, but it's really going to help provide nutrients. And in my landscape, I have a lot of squirrels, rabbits. Of course, my dogs are not helpful for any part of gardening. So I actually like to apply a 2 to 3 inch layer of compost and then mulch on top of that with a wood mulch. And the wood mulch can just help to keep it in place. But then when it rains, that compost is sort of staying in one spot. And then what happens is the water pushes through the compost, and then those nutrients are getting down to the soil. So for our established trees and shrubs, they can be a great additive as a mulch. In gardens, so if you're doing a vegetable garden or a flower garden, and I think this is sort of illustrated in the bottom picture, you can combine 1 to 4 inches within the soil or the potting media. And I don't recommend using very much compost in containers. It just tends to get kind of waterlogged in containers, and potting soil is just a better use for those. But if you have a big container of annuals or vegetables, you can incorporate a little bit in there, and it's just going to act like a fertilizer. So it's not going to really change the composition like with soil, but it will act like a fertilizer. You can also top dress them around plants. So if your compost pile looks like it's ready in June and you already had everything in the ground, feel free to just add it to the top of the soil, and it's going to improve the fertility for those plants. And then for lawns, now is actually a great time to add compost to your lawn. So if you're thinking about overseeding, or you're going to seed your lawn this fall, if you have a lawn like a zoysia or Bermuda that you do in the spring, you can do it in the spring. But just to do about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch broadcast over the grass. So if you have existing grass, sprinkle it over. If it's just bare soil, you can sprinkle it and then put down your grass seed. It can actually help to keep grass seed in place a little bit better. The important thing is you want to make sure that you're not putting it on so thick that you're crowding out the seed or you're crowding out the existing plant. So if you see in spots that you have 1 inch or more, you need to go through and thin that out, because it could actually crowd out the plants, and then you're not going to have grass in those areas. So when we're using compost, we can work it directly into the soil, or we can put it on top of the soil. It's good to work at about 6 to 8 inches for most of our perennial plants. The exception is if you are planting a tree What you don't want to do is dig a hole for the tree, put the tree in the hole, and then fill it with compost. Most of our soils in this area are heavy clay. So if you do a method like that, what you're going to end up with is a pot of water, because the compost is going to retain all of that water and it's going to have a hard time pushing it into the clay soil. So if you want to incorporate a good amount of compost when you're planting a new tree, Ward Upham, he's a specialist at K-State, he recommends tilling up a 10 by 10 foot area, incorporating the compost into that, and then planting your tree within that area. And that just helps to mix together the soil and the compost so that you don't end up just creating a little vase essentially for your newly planted tree that retains water. And fall is a great time. That's why we're doing this presentation now, to apply that compost. It can continue to process through the winter, and it'll be readily available for the plants in the spring. And then if you're looking to improve your soil structure with compost, that's not going to happen the second you apply it. It may not happen the second year that you apply it. We're looking at changes to soil happening in about a 3 to 5 year window. So if you want to improve your clay soils, today's the day to start. Start working that compost in and expect to see some improvements in soil structure and water retention in about 3 to 5 years. Okay, now for the problems with composting. So there are some issues that you can run into when you're creating composting. Sometimes you just pile things up and it just does not seem like it's doing anything. You just sort of see the materials sitting there. A lot of times that means that it's been too dry or that there are not enough greens. So we really need that green material to feed those microorganisms, and we need the water to keep the microorganisms happy. So make sure that it's damp sponge wet, and then also add some more greens. And I don't like to waste my nice clean city hose water on my compost bin. So I actually have a rain barrel really close to my compost bin. And when I go out and water my plants, I just water the compost bin at the same time. So make sure that wherever you place your compost bin, you do have access to some sort of water so that you can keep it as damp as it needs to be. If you have a rotten odor, you might have too much green material, so add some brown material and then keep that pile turned. A lot of times things rot when they're just sitting. So make sure that the green material that you're adding is getting worked to the bottom of the pile, to the inside of the pile, and then just add a little bit more browns to it. If you're not feeling your compost pile get hot, or if you're using your compost thermometer and is just not getting up to that 150 to 160 range, you can add more green material. That's going to help fuel that heat. A little bit more water, make sure it's damp, and then again, just making sure you're turning that pile. If you pile things up and you don't turn them, the center of the pile is not getting oxygen, and you're going to get those anaerobic conditions. It'll smell, and it's not going to get hot. And then if you do incorporate materials that have pests in them, so maybe a plant that was covered in aphids or weeds, you want to bury it. You don't want to have any meat in there, and then keep it covered. And that's going to take care of those. So that's sort of pests from two perspectives: adding materials that had pests on them, and then keeping things out of your compost bin, raccoons and things like that.
I have a question from the chat box, Ariel.
Yes.
Sharon Avery was saying she's done this method, but it tested at a pH of 7. And she was wondering if adding pine needles would help her pH level.
Pine needles and wood ashes can both raise your soil pH. 7 is not bad though. Typically most of our plants like between 6.5 and sometimes up to 7.5, but 6.5 to 7 is a good pH. So I wouldn't be concerned about a compost pile with a pH of 7, but both pine needles and ashes can actually raise your soil pH. So you want to be careful when you're incorporating those materials. Okay. And then your finished product. So this is what I was talking about, that beautiful, it almost looks like coffee grounds, just that beautiful, crumbly, dark mixture. There's not necessarily going to be a single point where you get to this. You're going to start to see this in a more as you turn your pile. I just turned my pile last weekend and I noticed that the middle of the pile looked like this, but there were definitely still some identifiable plant scraps sort of on the edge. So just to continue to turn until you get this look more consistently throughout your pile. It should have a great smell. It should be nice and fluffy, and it should be a pretty dark color when it's done. So composting, you know, I'm talking about the process, measuring the temperature and turning and all of those things. But you can do the passive process. You can pile things and let them just sort of naturally decompose. You just want to be careful when you're using that method about what you apply. I wouldn't passively compost manure if I was going to use it on edible crops. There's a chance that you could still get pathogens through that, even if it's cow or horse manure. I wouldn't do weed seeds in a passive method or diseased plants in a passive method. So you can just sort of allow things to rot. You just want to be mindful of what you're adding if you don't want to actively compost with the temperatures and the turning and everything like that. Okay, and then there's a couple other composting techniques that I just want to touch on. So trench composting is pictured in the bottom, trench and pit. It's essentially where you're digging for the plants that you're going to plant, and then you're adding that green material and then either piling the soil back on top of it to plant in the spring or planting directly on top of it. So that's just a way to add some of that green material to add some nutrients back into the soil without necessarily fully composting. Vermicomposting, which I touched on, is composting with worms. That is a great activity to do with kids. So if you are not freaked out by worms, that's a wonderful thing to do. The such important distinction is worms do not go in your compost pile. Your compost pile is going to get hot. It's not an ideal environment for worms. So if you want to do vermicomposting, that's something totally separate from having a big bin of compost. Typically, we see worm composting done in a very shallow tub, like a tote that you would store things in, something like that. They like different things than traditional composting. So not the same process, but it is another way to use those kitchen scraps and garden scraps and still get something really nutrient rich that you can use on your plants. And then compost tea is kind of cool. So you take the compost, about 1 part compost, and then you put 5 parts of water through it, so some kind of strainer, and then you can actually just pour that directly on plants. It's a water-soluble fertilizer. And then you can still use the compost that you use. You can either put it back in your compost pile or apply it to your plants. Obviously, you'll have taken out some of those nutrients, but it's still going to maintain all of its other beneficial properties. So that can be kind of a fun thing to do as well. And this can be helpful for things like containers or even houseplants, where I don't actually want to add compost to those containers. You can make a compost tea and use them as a little bit of a fertilizer in those situations. So here are some great resources because composting is obviously a really expansive topic, and I definitely just sort of hit the highlights today. There's a lot more to be learned about it. Let It Rot is probably the most famous book on composting. So I would highly recommend it. It's on my to-read list. I have not read it, but everyone that has read it has told me it's a great book. So I'd highly recommend that. There are some other good composting guides. And then the Center for Rural Enterprise put out the Building Soils for Better Crops. And it's a great handbook. It talks about composting. It talks about cover crops. So if you want to go a little bit more deep into the soil part of it, the Building Soils for Better Crop is a great resource to use as well. And then I have linked this right here, but as soon as I stop sharing my screen, I'm going to put it in the chat box. This is our website, and on there we have how to compost, troubleshooting guides, how to use it, quick composting, which I didn't talk about today, a lot of really helpful guides. So I'll make sure to put that in the chat box and then also include it in the follow-up email as well. So that is the end of my presentation, and I would love to answer your questions today. Let me go ahead and throw that link in the chat box while I'm thinking about it. Okay, what are our questions?
We didn't have any more in the chat box, but
Okay.
do we have composters with us?
Yes. I have a question, Ariel. This is Lynn Weaver. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you great.
Okay. You know, Ward told us not to dig. So I always have this conflict between digging compost into my soil to improve it, and then now we're not supposed to dig. So how do you resolve that?
It depends on the plant. So he is definitely opposed to digging, like I was talking about for a tree. And it also has a lot to do with where we're at, because I actually don't know anyone I've ever met that lives in this part of the state that doesn't have a clay soil. I've heard that people that live near the river have better soil, but I haven't seen it with my own eyes, so I don't know if I believe them or not.
Mm-hmm.
So we all have that heavy clay soil, and you run the risk when you're doing something like a tree that you're just going to create this pit where water pools if you fill that hole back in with compost. If you're mixing it in with the soil and it's not something as large as a tree, you shouldn't have that problem. But Ward does recommend, if you're doing a vegetable bed, a whole flower bed, his preference, and it has a lot of merit, is to incorporate it into a larger area rather than just a single hole where you could get some of those issues. But top dressing is also beneficial. You're going to see the benefits of changing your soil structure slower if you're only adding it to the top, but then you're not going to run into that risk of sort of creating that clay pit.
Okay, I have another question.
Okay.
We make our compost, and so I like to mulch the beds with compost when I get things planted in May.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always concerned that when it rains or when I water, and I'll confess I don't use a soaker hose, I'm always concerned that the water is not going to penetrate that 2 inches of compost to get to my plant roots.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. That is really important. Whenever we're applying any mulch, but it can happen especially with grass clippings as a mulch and compost, you do run the risk that your compost can create a layer that water does not penetrate. Mm-hmm. So if you think that's happening, there's a couple things you could do. You could apply a little bit less, or water your compost in really well like you would a mulch when you first apply it. And then after you water a couple times, move the compost aside and make sure that water is getting down to your plants. If you water really well and you move it aside and the ground below is still pretty dry, you need to take some compost off because it's not getting through. It can create a barrier.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great questions. Any other questions?
Ariel, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, I can hear you, Ed.
Okay. One of the things that I have been told by some people is to never use tomato plant or tomato vines in your compost, especially cold composting, because tomato vines have so many viruses, diseases, that what they really said was that it's just not worth it for what you get. Do you know anything more about that?
Yes. So if you're looking at some of the things that really commonly affect tomatoes, like septoria leaf spot or verticillium wilt, those things can be transmitted through a compost pile if you don't get it to that thermophilic stage, that 150 to 160 degrees for a few days. So my thing is, it needs to be a judgment call. Composting is very personal, so it needs to be a judgment call for you. If you're willing to, of course, chop it up small, get it up to that thermophilic stage, and then I would even go so far as to maybe having separate compost piles, and when you add tomato plants to one compost pile, maybe use those in the flower bed instead of putting those back in your vegetable bed. But if any of that sounds like you're not sure if you can do that, or if you had a really bad disease one year, I wouldn't do it. I would leave it out because you do run the risk that you could reintroduce those things.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think Carol had a question. Carol, do you want to unmute yourself? You're on mute, so there you go.
Muted.
There you
Here
go.
you are.
Okay, quick question. I think that composting could be a great way to get set up in the fall and plant your seed potatoes in the spring. Has anyone had any experience with that, or have you ever tried it, Ariel?
Are you talking about putting your seed potatoes in compost?
Yes, if you do a trench. I know for years when we've planted potatoes, it's been easy for my husband to make a trench and put a lot of leaves in it. And I just thought that actual compost, if it sat over the winter, could be a great way to kickstart a spring potato crop.
Absolutely, yeah. That would be a great way to get some good nutrients. Potatoes are kind of suckers for water and nutrients. So if you're not getting enough of that, they're going to end up being really small. I can speak from experience. I had like the world's saddest potato crop this year because, I mean, these were insulting potatoes. They were
We
small.
would tie you with total crop failure.
Yeah, it was, the squirrels didn't help me, but it wasn't the best. But yes, that would be a great idea to compost in an area or to compost and then add them and then plant potatoes in the spring. That would be a really good way to use it.
I think that'd be a great way to use it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have the best squash plant growing out of my compost bin this summer. Obviously, it didn't get up to temperature. It's a butternut squash, and this vine started growing out of the compost pile, and we just let it go, so we haven't been turning it. And I have 12 huge butternut squash out there, and they're just beautiful.
That's
So-
funny, Kathleen. Something about squash, their seeds are like the worst for like if you have a squash plant, if you have pumpkins on your front porch, one seed will always plant itself somewhere and then you just end up with a vine.
I agree.
And I'm glad you mentioned squash. Oh, go ahead. What'd you say, Carol?
Sometimes it's easy for the squash bugs to find that one or two volunteer seeds that come up, and they can just wipe out any kind of zucchini or any other kind of squash almost before you even know they're there.
That's actually exactly what I was going to say. So a really important part of squash bug control, which we've had a lot of reports of that this year, so I'm worried it's going to be bad next year, is to completely remove your squash plants from your vegetable garden and to chop that material up. So you can till it under into your vegetable garden, but it really needs to be disposed of because the squash bugs actually overwinter in the vines. And a great way to get rid of it is to chop it up and to put it in your compost pile. Squash bugs will not live through chopping of the vine or composting. So that's a great way to get rid of their overwintering habitat so that you have hopefully no or a lower squash bug population. So I'm glad that you guys both mentioned squash. It's important.
Ariel, I have a place where I just throw my garbage and stuff like that. And over the years, I have found that just planting cantaloupe or something like that right next to it, but not in it, and the plants really, really take off. So it does work.
I don't know what it is. They're great plants, but they're also like trash plants. They like seem to really thrive. You try to cultivate squash in your garden and they're gonna like wilt up and die. Like one squash bug looks at them and they're just gone. And meanwhile, like everybody's trash throwaway pile has them in it. So they're a funny plant.
Ariel?
Yes, Linda.
Sorry, I don't know why my picture's not there. I have to troubleshoot that. But I wanted to go back to a little bit of what Lynn referred to. And I think she was talking about where Ward had said tilling can destroy soil structure and not
Yes.
too much tilling. If you really need to get it in there, if your soil is very poor, then okay, put quite a bit and do that one time, but try not to till every year, and when you do till, don't make those small particles. Leave them in the big chunks. I think that's what because I know I struggled with that too, where a lot of times I will just put something on top. I might just take a big fork and loosen it a little bit to kind of get nutrients in there. But
I'm glad you mentioned that, Linda, because that is really important. Whenever you till, you are destroying soil structure. So it needs to be a balance. Is it maybe you're establishing, there you are, Linda. Maybe you're establishing a garden bed. And so you're going to till up the whole area and incorporate compost and plant a bunch of perennials. And then that garden bed is going to sit there for the next 15 years without really being disturbed. That's okay. But when you look at tilling every single year, that is something that's going to destroy your soil structure. Absolutely. I'm glad that you mentioned that. I wasn't thinking about it from an annual perspective. Everybody always thinks about their own garden, and I'm going to plant a tree this fall. And so that's like all I'm thinking about is like, am I going to add compost? Am I going to till that whole area? And that's the project I have on my mind.
This is Connie. Can you hear me? I have a question. I have access to some grass clippings, but it's Bermuda grass. And I don't want that to get started, obviously, in my garden. As long as I compost it really well and heat it up, it would be okay.
It will. I would be so careful because if you're transporting the Bermuda grass to your compost pile and this little essence of Bermuda grass falls into your lawn, that's enough. It's very aggressive. So the actual process of composting will kill it. So you're not going to get, because it's propagated by stolons, so you're not going to get Bermuda grass in your yard. I would just be careful about bringing it into your yard. Dried would be better. So if they let it dry and then you added it as a brown, that would be a lot lower risk than adding it as a green.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Connie, because a big question I get a lot is, well, I live by myself, or I just don't have trees, so I don't have a lot of brown, or I don't have a lot of green. Ask your friends, ask your neighbors, and ask local restaurants. Like I mentioned, we have a master gardener that gets tons of coffee grounds from a local coffee shop. And I think the coffee shop likes it because they can say, hey, we don't throw this stuff in the trash. Somebody takes it and uses it. And then, of course, our master gardener likes it because he has the world's coolest, biggest compost pile. So if you are needing those materials, ask. I've seen people on Facebook being like, hey, who has leaves? Because I want to compost this fall. And so that's I'm just deeming it to be a totally culturally acceptable thing to do, is to ask friends for yard waste.
Lots of coffee shops, and even the coffee shops in the grocery stores, like the Starbucks in the Dillons, they'll just have coffee grounds already all bagged up for you to take if you want them.
Yep, it's an awesome way to use them. I love, and I should have mentioned with the coffee grounds, filter and all. Throw the filter in there too. It'll break down, and that is like the #1 thing that I add to my compost bin. Big coffee drinker. So.
And then Carolyn Seals in the chat box says, when they lived in the country, they didn't rake leaves, and they'd just pick up bags of leaves from the curb that people would put out.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It's a good way to use them.
Yeah, nothing disturbs me more than a big old plastic bag full of leaves.
Mm-hmm.
I know. And those leaf bags that you get from like the hardware store that are kind of papery, I really like those because typically I have big oak trees. So when I bag my leaves, I have way more than I could put in my compost bin. They actually stand up pretty well to rain. And so I have bagged those, sort of put them under the eave of my garage, added them as needed. And then as they start to break down, I just throw the whole mess right into the compost bin. So those can be a great alternative too. If you have way too many leaves, there is a little bit of a way you can hold on to them before adding them to compost without using plastic. Oh, it looks like Judy Curtis said, can you add tea bags? Absolutely. The only thing is if your tea bag has a little staple on the end that has the type of tea, you just want to make sure to remove the staple, but you can add the string, the pouch, and the tea right in your compost bin. That's a great thing to add if you're a big tea drinker. Carolyn's running around stealing people's leaves. Hey, whatever it takes to make your compost.
Ariel, I just
Yes.
wanted to tell you my story about storing leaves. I got a bunch of plastic bags of leaves and I stored them right down next to the garden. And next spring, I picked them up and there was a copperhead snake under there.
Oh,
Oh no.
Yes. Fortunately, I had my hoe nearby.
Yeah, that would not be good. That's true though. Whenever you're piling things, there's always potential for wildlife.
Ed, have you ever heard of the lore surrounding copperheads that you smell like a cucumber type smell when they're near?
I never got that close to them.
You didn't get close to smell?
No.
That's too bad. What'd you say, Carol?
I said it's good for Ed that he didn't get close enough
Yeah.
to either smell him or.
He probably wouldn't be telling us the story.
That's right.
Well, if you guys have any other questions, I'm just going to drop my email address in the chat box for those of you that don't know me. And like I said, you can find all of the resources that I mentioned today on our composting website. It's a cool place to be. And I realized earlier today I don't have anything up on vermicomposting, and I should. So I will get something up on vermicomposting.
Well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to extend my thanks to Ariel. Thank you so much. I learned so much. And I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you learned something new today and feel encouraged to begin your own compost. So please join us next week at this same time for Master Gardener Linda Jackel's presentation, Living Soil. And we will see you then.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
thank you, Ariel
Thanks, bye.
and Leslie. Bye-bye.
Thank you.